You are drunk right now, just a little, and you don't even know it. Not from anything you drank today, from something inside you. Your gut is fermenting sugars this very second, producing trace amounts of ethanol as a natural byproduct of digestion. Scientists call it endogenous ethanol production. It's small, it's harmless, but it means alcohol isn't a human invention. It was already inside you before you were born, built into the machinery of digestion itself. So when did your ancestors first notice it? When did they first go looking for more? The answer is older, stranger, and more consequential than almost anyone expects. It may be older than farming, older than pottery, older, possibly, than language as we know it today. And the story of how humans found alcohol and what alcohol did to human society once we found it might be one of the most underrated turning points in the entire story of civilization. Let's go back and find out exactly how it happened. Long before there were breweries, before there were vineyards, before anyone had ever pressed a grape on purpose, there was fruit rotting on the forest floor. Overripe fruit, sitting in the heat, gets colonized by wild yeast. The yeast eats the sugar. The byproduct of that process is ethanol. This happens constantly, everywhere, with almost zero human involvement. A fallen fig, a bruised plum, a cluster of palm dates baking in the sun. Within days, they're mildly alcoholic, sometimes reaching 2 or 3%, roughly the strength of a light beer. This matters because it means alcohol existed in the environment of every fruit-eating primate for tens of millions of years, long before modern humans existed at all. In 2000, biologist Robert Dudley proposed something that sounded almost too strange to take seriously. He called it the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. His argument was simple. Fruit-eating primates evolved a strong attraction to the smell of ethanol because, in the wild, that smell reliably pointed to ripe, calorie-dense, sugar-rich fruit. The alcohol wasn't the reward. It was the signal. Animals that could smell fermentation from a distance found food faster than animals that couldn't. Over millions of years, this created something unusual in our biology. Humans, along with a handful of close primate relatives, carry a mutation in a gene called AG4. That mutation happened roughly 10 million years ago, and it dramatically increased our ancestors' ability to metabolize ethanol, breaking it down 40 times more efficiently than animals without the mutation. Chimpanzees and gorillas share this trait. Orangutans, who spend less time foraging on the forest floor near fallen fruit, do not. Read that again. 10 million years before the first human city, before the first human word was ever spoken, natural selection was already quietly rewarding the ancestors of humans who could handle alcohol. You didn't inherit a taste for alcohol by accident. You inherited it because your extremely distant ancestors who could tolerate it survived better than the ones who couldn't. So the appetite came first, millions of years before intention. But an appetite for accidental, low-alcohol rotting fruit is a long way from what we'd recognize as drinking. For that, we need something else. We need humans who noticed the effect, and who decided, on purpose, to make more of it. For that, the trail goes cold in the forests and picks back up in caves. In 2018, archaeologist Lailu and her team were examining stone mortars from Rakefet Cave, a Natufian burial site on Mount Carmel in modern-day Israel. The Natufians were a hunter-gatherer culture living roughly 13,000 years ago, right at the edge of the transition into farming, but not farmers yet. Inside the stone mortars, researchers found microscopic residue, starch granules that had been damaged in a very specific way, a pattern consistent with malting, mashing, and fermenting grain into a thick, beer-like alcoholic mash. Not bread, beer, or something close enough to beer that the distinction barely matters. This was thousands of years before anyone in the region was reliably farming wheat or barley as a staple crop. These were foragers who were gathering wild grain specifically, it seems, to brew it. And here's the detail that made archaeologists sit up. The residue was found associated with what appears to be a communal feasting and burial site. This wasn't someone's forgotten breakfast. This was, quite possibly, alcohol made on purpose for a ritual, a funeral, a gathering, a moment when a community needed to come together and mark something as significant. 13,000 years ago, humans weren't just discovering alcohol by accident anymore. They were making it, on purpose, for an occasion. This lines up with something anthropologists have long suspected but struggled to prove, that the desire to drink together, not just to eat together, may have been one of the forces that pulled scattered hunter-gatherer groups into larger, more permanent settlements. There's a name for this idea. Some researchers call it the beer before bread hypothesis, first proposed in a serious way by biochemist Solomon Katz in the 1980s. Katz argued that early humans may not have domesticated wild grains primarily to eat them as food. Wild einkorn and wild barley, unprocessed, are difficult to digest, low in nutrition relative to the effort required to harvest and grind them, and frankly, not very appetizing. But fermented into a mildly alcoholic gruel, those same grains become easier to digest, more nutritious, thanks to the vitamins produced during fermentation, and, critically, they produce a mild, intoxicating effect that a hunter-gatherer group might have valued enough to justify the enormous labor of deliberately cultivating grain year after year. In other words, it's possible that beer, or something like it, came before bread. Possible that the desire to get a group of exhausted, overworked foragers pleasantly buzzed at the end of a long day helped motivate the shift toward agriculture itself. Picture it. You are living in the hill country near what is now the Sea of Galilee, roughly 13,000 years ago. Your group doesn't farm. You move with the seasons, following wild herds and wild grain stands. But once a year, maybe twice, something happens. Someone dies, or a marriage happens, or a season changes. And on that day, several extended family groups, people you rarely see, travel from a distance to gather in one place. Someone has been preparing for weeks. Wild grain has been soaked, left to sprout slightly, ground with stone, mixed with water, and left in a shaded stone basin to sit. The wild yeast, floating invisibly in the air the way it always has, gets to work. By the time everyone arrives, the mixture has turned faintly fizzy, faintly sour, faintly warm in the chest. There is no music like the music you're used to. No writing, no calendar on a wall. But there is this. A shared cup or shared basin, passed hand to hand. A slight loosening in the shoulders. Laughter that comes a little easier. Strangers from another camp who, an hour ago, eyed you with caution, now sit closer. This is not a coincidence. Alcohol, at low to moderate doses, reliably reduces social anxiety and increases feelings of trust and bonding. Modern behavioral research confirms what your Natfian ancestors seem to have already understood instinctively. A group that drinks together, briefly and occasionally, often cooperates better afterward. So the funeral, or the gathering, becomes something more. It becomes the reason 4 separate bands of humans, who might otherwise never trust each other enough to share resources, exchange partners, or defend each other against a common threat, choose instead to link themselves together. This is one of the quiet arguments for why permanent settlements began to form in the first place, not purely because farming was more efficient. In many cases, early farming was harder and less reliable than foraging. But because something, whether it was grain or bread or the fermented byproduct of grain, was worth staying in one place to protect, cultivate, and return to year after year. By the time we reach the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to roughly 11,600 years ago, we find enormous carved limestone pillars, arranged in circular enclosures, built by hunter-gatherers who, again, had not yet fully committed to agriculture. Archaeologist Oliver Dietrich and his colleagues discovered large stone vats at the site, some capable of holding over 160 liters of liquid, with residue suggesting they'd been used to ferment grain mash. Their theory, still debated but taken seriously, is that Göbekli Tepe may have functioned partly as a feasting site, a place where scattered groups gathered periodically to build something monumental together and to drink together while doing it. If that theory holds, it means one of the very first large-scale cooperative building projects in human history, a structure so old it predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, may have been fueled, quite literally, by beer. Now travel east, several thousand years later, to the Yellow River Valley in central China. At the site of Jiahu, dated to between 7,000 and 9,000 BCE, biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern, sometimes nicknamed the Indiana Jones of ancient alcohol for spending his career chasing residue in old pottery shards, analyzed chemical traces left inside clay jars. What he found was a fermented beverage made from a mixture of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit or grape, not a single ingredient beer. A deliberately engineered, mixed, fermented drink, blending a grain, a fruit sugar source, and a natural sweetener in the correct proportions to reliably ferment. This tells us something important. by roughly 9,000 years ago, in a completely separate part of the world from the Near East, humans had independently arrived at the same idea. Take what ferments naturally, combine it deliberately, and make more of it than nature would ever produce on its own. Two civilizations, thousands of miles apart, never in contact, discovering the exact same trick at roughly the same distant point in human history. Not because one taught the other, because the appetite, remember, was already 10 million years old. The knowledge of how to satisfy it was bound to be rediscovered again and again, wherever grain, fruit, and warm weather intersected. By the time we reach ancient Egypt, roughly 5,000 years ago, alcohol has stopped being an occasional ritual curiosity and become something closer to infrastructure. At the site of Abydos, archaeologists uncovered what may be one of the largest known breweries of the ancient world, dated to around 3,100 BCA, capable of producing an estimated 22,000 liters of beer at a time. This wasn't a monastery brewing quietly on the side. This was industrial-scale production, tied directly to the state. Egyptian laborers who built the pyramids weren't paid in coins. They were paid, in large part, in bread and beer, distributed daily as a standard wage. Beer wasn't a luxury in ancient Egypt. It was closer to a form of currency, a nutritional staple, and, functionally, a partial payroll system for one of the largest labor forces in the ancient world. Which means, if you want to be dramatic about it, some of the largest and most enduring structures ever built by human hands were raised, at least in part, by workers who were compensated with alcohol. So somewhere between fermenting fruit on a forest floor and paying pyramid builders in beer, alcohol quietly stopped being an accident of nature and became one of the load-bearing walls of early civilization itself. A reason to gather, a reason to build, a reason to stay. Here is the counterintuitive twist, the part that flips almost everything you've just heard on its head. We tend to assume that alcohol is a symptom of civilization. That once humans became advanced enough, they invented recreational drinking as a kind of luxury, a reward for progress. The evidence suggests something closer to the opposite. Alcohol may not have been a product of civilization. It may have been one of civilization's ingredients, not a reward for settling down. Possibly one of the reasons humans settled down at all. And there's a darker thread in that same twist. If Solomon Katz is right, and grain domestication was motivated in part by the desire to brew, then the earliest deliberate cultivation of crops wasn't purely about survival or nutrition. It was, in part, driven by a desire that has nothing to do with calories at all. The desire to feel, briefly, a little different than you did a moment ago. That desire, the same one that pulled a fruit-eating primate toward the smell of fermentation 10 million years ago, is the same desire sitting in your own brain chemistry right now. The mutation that let your extremely distant ancestors survive on fallen, fermenting fruit is the exact same biological machinery processing whatever you drank last weekend. Which brings us to the mirror. The uncomfortable, quiet mirror this story holds up to you. Every time you've shared a drink with someone, at a wedding, a funeral, a Friday night that felt like it needed to feel a little softer than the rest of the week, you were participating in something that is, provably, at least 13,000 years old and arguably 10 million years old at the level of your own biology. You didn't invent the impulse to gather around something fermented and let your guard down a little. You inherited it, from foragers grinding wild grain in stone mortars beside a burial site on Mount Carmel. From builders raising stone pillars they couldn't have lifted without cooperating, and couldn't have cooperated without trusting each other, and may not have trusted each other without the beer that helped make that trust possible. We like to think of ourselves as separate from our ancestors, more rational, more deliberate, less driven by primal appetite. But the next time you watch a group of strangers loosen up around a shared drink, watch the tension leave someone's shoulders, watch two people who arrived as acquaintances leave as something closer to friends, you are not watching something modern. You are watching something that is, provably, one of the oldest social technologies our species ever built. Older than the wheel. Older than writing. Possibly older than the sentence you just read. You are drunk right now, just a little, and you don't even know it. Your ancestors knew it before they knew almost anything else about themselves. And it might be one of the reasons any of us ever learned to build anything together at all.